In early 1949, a wealthy widow living at one of London's most elegant hotels told a charming fellow resident about a business idea she had been developing. He listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and told her his engineering company would be very interested. He invited her to his workshop to see the operation firsthand. She was delighted. She dressed in her finest black Persian lamb coat, met him in the hotel lobby, and stepped into his car. She did not return that evening. She did not appear at breakfast the following morning. And when investigators eventually found the evidence left behind at his workshop in Crawley, they realized she was not the first. She was not even close to the first. There had been 6 before her, all people who had trusted him completely, all gone without a trace. Nobody had connected a single one of them. And the man responsible had been living in plain sight the entire time. The man and William McSwan had known each other since the late 1930s, when our man had worked briefly as William's chauffeur. They had stayed loosely in touch through the years, the kind of friendship built on shared drinks and easy conversation, rather than anything deep. William was doing well. He had sold his amusement arcade business and was now collecting rent from a portfolio of properties his parents owned across London. He had money coming in regularly. He had a comfortable life. On the evening of September 6th, 1944, the two men met at a pub on Kensington High Street, as they had done several times before. William had no reason to think this evening would be any different. They went from the pub to a basement flat in Gloucester Road. The door closed behind them. William McSwan never left that basement. What remained of him 2 days later was disposed of. His watch, his wallet, and anything of value had been taken. A postcard was sent from Scotland, supposedly from William himself, to explain his sudden absence. He had gone into hiding, the card said, to avoid military conscription. His parents, Donald and Amy, had every reason to believe it. William had registered as a conscientious objector at the start of the war and had lived in fear of being called up. The story was believable. The story held. And while it held, the man responsible moved into William's house and began collecting his rent. For almost a year, the arrangement worked. But as Allied victory in Europe became certain and the war drew to a close, the excuse for William's continued hiding began to fall apart. There would be no reason to hide once peace arrived. And Donald and Amy McSwan, who had accepted the story for months, were beginning to ask questions that did not have good answers. The solution was simple, in the way that everything was simple for the man at the center of this story. On July 2nd, 1945, he brought Donald to the Gloucester Road basement first, then Amy, separately, one after the other. Both lost their lives that day. Both were placed into chemical containers. By this time, he had acquired thick rubber gloves, a heavy apron, and a breathing mask. He had learned from his first attempt. He was more prepared, more efficient, more clinical. He then traveled to a solicitor's office, posing as William McSwan using forged documents, and gained power of attorney over the family's properties. He sold what he could, collected what remained, and walked away with approximately £8,000, equivalent to several £100,000 in today's money. 3 people gone, not one investigation, not one person looking in his direction. He moved into the Onslow Court Hotel and settled in comfortably. The money did not last. It never did. By 1947, the Onslow Court money was nearly gone. Gambling had taken most of it. He was a compulsive and reckless gambler who could burn through large sums with remarkable speed. He needed new victims. He needed people with assets worth taking, people he could get close to, people whose disappearance could be explained away. He had done it before. He knew exactly how to do it again. He found the Hendersons through a property advertisement. Dr. Archibald Henderson and his wife Rosalie were wealthy socialites with expensive tastes, a fondness for parties, and an unstable marriage. Archie drank heavily. Rosalie was anxious and prone to confiding in people she felt understood her. They were, in other words, precisely the kind of people a charming and attentive man could work his way into very effectively. He told them he was interested in buying their house in Ladbroke Square. He had £26 in his bank account at the time. The offer was never going to proceed. But that was not the point. The point was the introduction. He found a shared interest through music, began visiting regularly, walked their dog, attended their parties. He made himself indispensable and entirely trustworthy. He also, during one of his visits, quietly took note of where Archibald kept his revolver. He had by this point arranged for the transfer of his equipment, the drums, the acid, the tools of what had become for him a practiced method, to a rented storehouse on Leopold Road in Crawley. Everything was in place. On February 12th, 1948, he drove Dr. Henderson down to Crawley on the pretense of showing him the workshop. Once inside, he used Archibald's own revolver, the one he had taken from the Henderson house, to end the doctor's life. He placed the body in a drum and drove back to collect Rosalie. He told her that Archie had been taken suddenly ill and needed her immediately. She came without hesitation. She trusted him completely. Rosalie Henderson lost her life in that same workshop that same afternoon. He used acid to destroy evidence, tipped the remains behind the workshop, including, he noted later without particular concern, an evidence had not been fully destroyed, and set about forging letters in the Hendersons' names. They had gone to South Africa, the letters explained. There had been some financial trouble. Their friend was handling their affairs in their absence. Rosalie's brother Arnold grew deeply suspicious, especially when a letter arrived suggesting the Hendersons owed their friend a substantial sum of money, payable in property. Arnold came to London to investigate. He found nothing connecting his instincts to the truth. The man in front of him was too helpful, too reasonable, too plausible to be anything other than what he said he was. Arnold eventually gave up and went home. Another narrow escape. He walked away from the Hendersons with over £8,000, back to the Onslow court, back to the gambling tables, back to the life he intended to maintain, no matter what it cost. By early 1949, the cycle had completed itself again. He was behind on his hotel bills. He owed money to bookmakers across London. He needed a solution, and he needed one quickly. The Onslow Court Hotel, with its collection of wealthy elderly residents, was a natural place to find one. Olive Durand Deacon was 68 years old, a widow, and a woman of comfortable means who lived in room 115. She was sharp, sociable, and proud. She had developed a business idea she was excited about, artificial fingernails, and had been looking for someone with engineering knowledge who might help bring it to reality. When she mentioned the idea over dinner to the charming man at the table, he told her his company would be very interested. He had a workshop. They could go and look at some prototypes. He was most enthusiastic. On February 18th, 1949, Olive Durand Deacon put on her black Persian lamb coat, met him in the hotel lobby after lunch, and got into his car. Fellow resident Constance Lane saw her leave. Constance knew about the appointment and was aware of who Olive had gone with. Olive did not return that evening. At the workshop in Crawley, Olive was harmed with the same revolver he had used on the Hendersons. she was placed into a drum of sulfuric acid. He drove to a nearby town, had lunch, returned to check on the process, and then drove back to London. Within 2 days, very little recoverable evidence remained, which had resisted the acid. He tipped the contents of the drum onto the ground behind the workshop, collected her jewellery and fur coat, and sent the coat to a dry cleaner in Reigate. He then sold the jewellery to a shop on Middle Street in Horsham, 4 separate visits over 10 days. He returned to the Onslow Court Hotel, expressed concern about Olive's whereabouts to the other residents, and offered to accompany Constance Lane to the police station to report her missing. He sat in that police station and spoke with detectives about the disappearance of a woman he had attacked hours earlier. He answered every question. He appeared genuinely worried. He was entirely convincing. It was the last time that act would work for him. Constance Lane had been specific with police. Olive had gone to Crawley with a man named George Haigh. She had told Constance all about the appointment beforehand. Police began making inquiries. They checked George Haigh's background. What they found was not the record of a respectable businessman and engineer. It was a history of fraud, forgery, and multiple prison sentences. Investigators visited the jeweller on Middle Street in Horsham. The jeweller confirmed that a man matching Haigh's description had visited the shop 4 times in the past 10 days and sold them a collection of jewellery that he now identified as belonging to the missing woman. The link was direct and undeniable. Haigh was brought in for questioning. Police obtained a warrant for his workshop in Crawley and sent a team to search it. What investigators found at the Leopold Road workshop was not the clean, professionally managed space of an innocent engineer. It was a carefully assembled operation. There were large containers and chemical supply, a rubber apron, thick gloves, and a breathing mask. In a briefcase, police recovered a revolver along with documents in names they did not recognize, including papers connected to the McSwan and Henderson families. Tucked in the same briefcase was a dry cleaner's receipt for a black Persian lamb coat. And outside, in the ground behind the workshop where the drums had been tipped, a pathologist named Dr. Keith Simpson got to work. What he found there became one of the most significant pieces of forensic analysis in British legal history. Substantial biological evidence, multiple forensic fragments, 3 biological evidences, partial human remains, and a set of upper and lower dentures that, within 48 hours, were identified by Olive Duran Deacon's own dentist as belonging to his patient. There was far more forensic evidence than he expected. When confronted with the jewellery identification, Haigh knew the game was over. What he said next in that police interview room was remarkable. Not because it was a confession born of guilt or remorse, but because it was delivered with the same confidence and calculation he had brought to everything else. He told detectives that Olive Duran Deacon no longer existed, that he had used acid in an attempt to eliminate evidence. He said they should see their faces. He laughed. And then he told them they could not prove a crime without a body. When detectives informed him that under English law a body was not required for a murder conviction, something shifted in his thinking. He pivoted immediately. He asked, with great interest, whether anyone was ever released from Broadmoor, the high-security psychiatric hospital. The question told investigators everything they needed to know about what his defense was going to be. He then confessed to 6 cases: William McSwan, Donald and Amy McSwan, Dr. Archibald Henderson, Rosalie Henderson, and Olive Duran Deacon. He also mentioned 3 additional cases that could never be conclusively proven. The trial of John George Haigh opened on July 18, 1949, at Lewes Assizes in East Sussex. he was charged with the case of Olive Duran Deacon. He entered a plea of not guilty, not on the basis that he had not done it, but on the basis that he was legally insane at the time. His defense team did not dispute the facts of the case. They accepted that the events had occurred exactly as described. Their argument was narrower and more specific, that Haigh did not know at the time of each act that what he was doing was legally wrong. This argument was based on what is known as the Monaghan Rules, established in 1843 following the trial of a Scottish man named Daniel Monaghan, who had shot a civil servant while suffering from delusions. The rules set out the legal standard for insanity in British courts. A defendant must either not have known what they were doing, or not have known it was wrong. If either condition was met, the insanity defense could succeed. To support the argument, Haigh had prepared elaborately. He told psychiatrists about recurring dreams involving forests of crucifixes dripping with something dark and red. He spoke about a man in the dream who approached him with a cup and told him to drink. He described disturbing compulsions. He made deeply disturbing claims about post-crime behavior. He framed himself as a man driven by forces beyond his conscious control, a figure caught in the grip of something ancient and unstoppable. The prosecution was not impressed. Neither, ultimately, was the jury. The prosecution pointed to the evidence of careful planning, the equipment ordered in advance, the drums sourced and prepared, the acid purchased in bulk, the cover stories constructed and maintained, the forged letters, the stolen identities, the property sold through fraudulent documents. This was not the behavior of a man who did not understand what he was doing or did not know it was wrong. This was the behavior of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and had taken extensive steps to avoid being caught for it. The prosecution also drew the jury's attention to a question Haigh had asked shortly after his arrest: whether anyone was ever released from Broadmoor. It was a small moment, but a revealing one. A man genuinely unaware of the wrongness of his actions does not ask whether the psychiatric hospital he might be sent to has a discharge process. The jury deliberated for 17 minutes. They returned a verdict of guilty. Judge Travers Humphreys sentenced George Haigh to death. On August 10th, 1949, at Wandsworth Prison in London, George Haigh was put to death. He was 39 years old. He was buried within the prison grounds, his body remaining intact, a simple thing he had never allowed any of his 6 confirmed victims. Now that the full account of the crimes and the trial has been told, the question that remains is the one that always remains with cases like this. Who was this man before all of it? And what made him into the person who sat in that interview room and laughed? His name was George Haigh. He was born on July 24th, 1909, in Stamford, Lincolnshire. He grew up in the small village of Outwood in Yorkshire, the only child of John and Emily Haigh, both deeply committed members of a strict Protestant religious group called the Plymouth Brethren. The Plymouth Brethren were not a gentle faith. They believed themselves to be a chosen people, set apart from and superior to those around them. Newspapers were banned in the Haigh household. Outside friendships were discouraged. John Sr. had built a wall around the property, several feet tall, to separate the family from neighbours he considered inferior. The only book in the house was the Bible. The only framework for understanding the world came through the lens of sin, divine judgment, and the absolute authority of religious law. John Sr. had a small blue scar on his forehead. He told his son it was the mark of Satan, that sin left visible marks on the body. and that if young John ever behaved wrongly, a similar mark would appear on him. John lay awake at night with his hand pressed to his forehead, waiting. The mark never came. No matter what he did, no mark appeared. He began, quietly and privately, to draw his own conclusions from this. He was untouchable. The rules that applied to other people did not apply to him. He could not be marked. He could not be reached. At school, John was bright but unengaged. He won a scholarship to Wakefield Cathedral, where he became a choir boy and played the organ with genuine talent. He excelled in mathematics, chemistry, and draftsmanship. He was also, by multiple accounts, a bully, precise, controlled, cold in the way he chose his targets. After school, John worked briefly in insurance and advertising before turning to fraud. He was caught, convicted, and imprisoned. Released, he moved to London, found employment as a chauffeur, set up a fake solicitor's office, sold fraudulent shares, was caught again, imprisoned again. The pattern repeated through the 1930s into the early 1940s. He was a skilled forger, one of the best Britain had seen, according to investigators who studied his work. He could copy a person's handwriting without any visible variation. He practiced expressions in front of mirrors, working through different faces until each one looked entirely natural. He was, in the language of those who later studied him, a man who had no internal sense of other people as real, only as resources, obstacles, or opportunities. During one of his stretches in prison in the early 1940s, he read about a French offender named George Haigh, who used acid to conceal his crimes. He found the approach interesting. He tested the method beforehand. He believed then, and continued to believe until the biological evidence turned up in that yard in Crawley, that a person who attacked was a person who could never be traced. No body meant no crime. No crime meant no conviction. It was, in his mind, a perfectly engineered solution to the problem of evidence. What it was not, what nothing about John George Haigh ever was as clever as he believed. 6 people were formally connected to John George Haigh and confirmed in the trial record. William McSwan, September 1944. Donald McSwan and Amy McSwan, July 1945. Dr. Archibald Henderson and Rosalie Henderson, February 1948. Olive Duran Deacon, February 1949. 3 additional cases were mentioned in his confession, but could not be proven to the standard required for formal charges. Each of the 6 confirmed victims had trusted him. Each had been brought into his world through a carefully built friendship, a business proposition, or a simple act of neighborly warmth. None of them had any reason to suspect the man in the tailored suit who listened so attentively and remembered small details and always seemed so very glad to see them. That was what made him dangerous. Not the acid, not the drums, not the forgeries. What made him dangerous was the ease with which he could make people feel safe. John George Haigh was executed on August 10th, 1949. He was buried inside Wandsworth Prison. 3 days before his death, he had donated his clothing and personal effects to Madame Tussauds Waxwork Museum in London, specifying that the clothes should be used to dress his likeness accurately. He spent his final days ensuring the display would look exactly right. Even at the very end, the performance mattered more to him than anything else. The most dangerous people in any room are often the ones who seem the most trustworthy. The charm, the confidence, and the careful attention are sometimes exactly what you need to watch most closely. Share this video so more people understand how cases like this unfold and what warning signs were there all along. Subscribe for more true crime stories told with care for the real people at the center of them. Stay alert, trust the details that don't add up, and look out for the people around you.